As American soldiers pushed through the Ardennes in late 1944, they started stumbling across a weapon none of them had ever laid eyes on before. A rifle that fired on both semi and full auto, accurate out to 600 meters, and light enough to carry on the move unlike most automatic weapons of the time. It was called the STG-44, and the Germans fielded tens of thousands of them along the Western Front that winter. But, despite its obvious advantages, American troops would keep even the notoriously hated M3 grease gun over swapping it for an STG, and those who tried it would regret their decision. So, why were American soldiers leaving behind a gun that supposedly revolutionized modern warfare? Just to give you a little context, let's begin by explaining the very moment the Americans got their hands on the gun, because it explains the deep hatred the US soldiers carried for it much better than words can. When the Germans launched their last major offensive of the war during the Battle of the Bulge, over 200,000 German troops smashed into a thinly held 85-mile stretch of the American line, and in the chaos of those first days, entire units from both sides were overrun and captured. The American 106th Infantry Division lost around 8,000 men in a matter of days, 2 full regiments essentially surrounded and forced to surrender. But as the US Army inevitably managed to push the Wehrmacht out of the Ardennes, the Germans left behind tons of equipment and supply depots. So suddenly, American soldiers were walking around stacks of the legendary MP-44, or better known as the STG-44. And soldiers everywhere picked them up out of curiosity, because the gun genuinely seemed like a secret superweapon, something out of a sci-fi movie, and it should have been an obvious upgrade over the M1 Garand or the grease gun. But it didn't take long before US troops all across the front realized how flawed it truly was. The very first thing soldiers noticed was its absurdly heavy weight. The STG-44 itself weighed about 11 pounds loaded, which was way heavier than the M1 Garand at around 9.5 pounds, which made it generally impractical during long walks. But the biggest problems American soldiers faced was the desperate supply shortages. The gun fired a unique intermediate cartridge, the 7.92 by 33mm Kurz round, and it used 30-round curved magazines that were not compatible with anything else in the American supply chain. Both the Garand and M1 carbine used their respective 30-06 and the .30 carbine cartridge, so if a GI wanted to use the STG, he only had a few spare mags that came with it before he had to ditch it. And since the 7.92 by 33mm Kurz was relatively new and only came with the FG-42, STG-44 and a few other weapons, resupply of a captured German intermediate cartridge was basically zero. So, most soldiers who grabbed STGs from dead Germans or abandoned positions found themselves with maybe 90 to 120 rounds if they were lucky. But the ammunition problem was only the beginning of it, because the STG had a few rarely discussed flaws in its design. The STG-44's receiver was made largely from stamped sheet steel, which the Germans had developed specifically because they were running short on machined components by 1943, since the tide had turned hard on the Eastern Front. In dry and relatively normal conditions, it worked reasonably well, but the Ardennes in December was anything but that. American soldiers were marching through frozen residue and mud that could bring the best maintained weapons to a halt, and the STG-44 was not the best maintained weapon. The guns American troops were finding had often been through months of combat on the Eastern or Western Front, and under those circumstances, maintenance had started slipping, and the sheet steel construction was more vulnerable to the kind of abuse frontline weapons take than more rugged guns like the Kar-98K. The 30-round magazine lips, which controlled how rounds fed into the chamber, were thin and easy to deform, and a deformed magazine meant it often misfed, or it simply stopped. One American after-action report from the period noted that captured STG-44s showed disproportionate failure rates compared to American weapons under similar field conditions. But to fully understand why the STG-44 failed so badly, you have to understand why what American soldiers were already carrying was considered better. The M1 Garand was, by almost every objective measure, the finest standard infantry rifle of the Second World War. General Patton even called it the greatest battle implement ever ever devised, and he was a man that was very difficult to please. The Garand was semi-automatic and fired the full-power 30-06 cartridge out to effective ranges well beyond 600 meters from an 8-round on-block clip, farther than the STG-44 could manage on its intermediate round. And, since American soldiers had trained on the Garand for years, they trusted it, and their entire supply chain, from ammunition to spare parts to the muscle memory of every man in the unit, was built around it. The army had produced more than 4 million of them by the end of the war, and that wasn't for fun. But it was not just the Garand that made the STG redundant in American hands. American infantry squads also carried the M1 carbine, a lightweight semi-automatic weapon chambered in .30 carbine that filled exactly the role the STG-44 was designed for. Close to medium range engagements with a lighter weapon than a full battle rifle, which was literally perfect for paratroopers, whereas the STG was way too heavy. Beyond that, squads had the Browning automatic rifle, or the BAR, which gave them a fully automatic weapon capable of suppressing enemy positions at a weight their men could actually carry forward. So, when a US troop looked at an STG-44, what he was actually looking at was a gun that tried to do 3 jobs the Americans had already split across 3 separate weapons, each optimized for its own role. The STG was a jack of all trades, but a master of none. And then there was the grease gun itself, which tells you something remarkable about the whole story. The M3 grease gun was possibly the ugliest weapon the Americans fielded in the entire war, a sheet metal tube that looked like something a mechanic had knocked together on a slow afternoon. Soldiers openly mocked it, gave it its nickname because of how much it resembled an automotive grease gun. But they still held onto it over the STG-44, and that fact alone says way more about the STG's practical limitations than any technical breakdown could. The grease gun fired the .45 ACP, a round that every American base in Europe had an enormous supply, and it was so simple that it almost never broke and could be used by even beginners. It was also much lighter than the STG at around 8 pounds loaded, but the hatred American troops had for the STG-44 was not the whole story of the weapon, and it was not even close to the full picture. On the Eastern Front, the STG-44 was doing something genuinely unprecedented, and the German units that received it in numbers understood almost immediately that they had something truly unique. The problem on the Eastern Front was far different from the Western or the Pacific theater. German infantry were facing Soviet forces who frequently outgunned them at close range with the PPSH-41, a submachine gun that infamously fired pistol ammunition at 900 rounds per minute, and that Soviet soldiers had tons of them. At longer ranges, the German Kar-98K had the edge, but the engagements increasingly happened at mid-range or sometimes even within 5 meters. The 100 to 400 meter distances was where a full power rifle was too slow and a submachine gun ran out of accuracy. The STG-44 owned that range, and in the hands of units that had steady ammunition supply and proper maintenance conditions, it was devastating. The 16th Panzer Grenadier Division, which received STG-44s in significant numbers in 1944, reported that the weapon had fundamentally changed how their squads engaged Soviet infantry, allowing single men to lay down suppressive fire that previously required a crew-served weapon like the MG-34 or 42. Not exactly the topic of this video, but the Germans also fitted some STG-44s with a curved barrel attachment called the Krummlauf, literally designed to shoot around corners with a periscope sight so the soldier never had to expose himself. It sounds like something out of a cartoon, and in practice it basically was. The barrel wore out after roughly 300 rounds and accuracy was near zero. However, the weapon had a problem that its own designer, Hugo Schmeisser, either ignored or could not solve, and it is why the STG-44 ended up mattering far more after the war than during it. Hitler himself had initially banned the development of the weapon because he believed Germany needed heavy rifles and not what he saw as a waste of resources on an intermediate cartridge. Walter and Hänel got around this by developing it under the code name Maschinenpistole 43, a submachine gun, so the paperwork would not catch his attention. By the time Hitler actually fired one and changed his mind, reportedly saying this is what was needed all along, the war was already turning irreversibly against Germany after Stalingrad. And the factories producing the STG-44 were being bombed around the clock by Allied aircraft, and the German supply of the Kurz cartridge could not scale fast enough to equip the front in the numbers that might have mattered in 1942 or even 1943. Germany produced around 425,000 STG-44s by the end of the war, which sounds like a lot until you realize the Soviets produced over 5 million PPSH-41s across the exact same period. The weapon that supposedly revolutionized infantry combat arrived way too late in far too few numbers, with too fragile a supply chain to realistically change the outcome of anything. But the STG system would become so revolutionary that it later inspired some of the most iconic weapons of the 20th century. The war ended in May 1945, and the STG-44 went into storage units across Germany. But the engineers and military planners who walked through captured German factories and examined the weapon understood exactly what they were looking at. The concept, a select-fire infantry rifle chambered in an intermediate cartridge, lighter and more controllable than a battle rifle but effective beyond the range of a submachine gun, was genius. But the Germans had just applied it too late and to a military that was already under a full collapse. The Soviets were not going to make that same mistake. Mikhail Kalashnikov, a tank commander who had been wounded and spent his recovery studying captured German weapons, had been working on his own designs since 1944. The AK-47, which he completed in 1947, was not a direct copy of the STG-44. Despite what decades of comparison have suggested, the internal mechanisms are quite different, but the concept was identical. An intermediate cartridge, the 7.62 by 39mm, in a select fire platform that could be manufactured simply, maintained by soldiers with minimal training and issued all across the world. This was where the STG-44's real legacy diverged completely from its wartime reputation. The AK-47 went into Soviet service in 1949 and has since been produced in estimates ranging from 75 to 100 million units, making it comfortably the most manufactured firearm in human history. Every war fought after 1950, from Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan to conflicts still happening today, has been shaped directly by the concept the STG-44 introduced. The Americans themselves, after watching their soldiers in Korea, discovered that the full-power 30-06 was often more powerful than a close jungle firefight needed, began their own journey toward an intermediate cartridge. That process eventually produced the M16, chambered in 5.56 by 45mm, which entered service in Vietnam and remains the basis of American infantry rifles to this day. NATO standardized on intermediate cartridges. The Warsaw Pact standardized on intermediate cartridges, and every major military on Earth now equips its infantry with weapons built around the principle the STG-44 demonstrated first. So, the American soldiers who tossed their captured STGs into ditches and went back to their Garans were not wrong given their situation, tactical doctrine, and the weapons they already had. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing.